So the first year that you can actually be assessed on is 1600. You won't get a text from before that, and you'll be given 2 texts to look at and draw comparisons between, and there will be a significant time difference between them. That could be 100 years, it could be 400 years. Okay, so it could be 1600 and something from the 2000s, or it could be just a text from 1800 and 1900. Okay, but you need to be aware of some of the conventions of text from each sort of era, so that you know what might be there. However, some of those things won't be, might not be in the text that you're looking at, and that's absolutely fine. If you find a text that's atypical, comment on that and why that might be, and what the reasons might be for that. So a key thing really early in the 1600s is the King James Bible, very key text, where King James basically puts out a Bible that he wants to unite the country in what he wants to be sort of a plain, direct form of English, and it's that first effort, or one of the first efforts, to sort of standardise the language and produce text for everyone. Okay, there's still high levels of illiteracy, but it's the start of that movement towards a more standard form of English. One problem that King James had, of course, was that he tried to translate phrases very literally, which meant that we had all sorts of odd phrases. It looked like he'd sort of passed biblical works through Google Translate 3 or 4 times, and they came out sort of slightly nonsensical. But the effort was certainly there from King James. So in terms of the 1600s, what's going on? It's these things, and this is the context you are likely to draw on. Only draw on those that are relevant to the text, but if you're talking about some of these things, you're probably showing some decent insight for AO3. Okay, so there's low literacy levels, especially among the poor. So texts that are written are probably not for the poorer people. It's probably a narrower audience in the 1600s. There's very little formal schooling, so again, generally speaking, the written texts are not for everyone. There's a small audience straight away, because the very fact that a large proportion of the population can't read them excludes that audience. Women are fairly subordinate in society, so by and large texts will be written by men for men, not always, but the female experience will be one that they were primarily seen as domestic creatures and subservient to their husbands. You've got this rising middle class because there's new trade opportunities, there's new sort of business opportunities, so you are having people now who have money who didn't used to. You've got the Renaissance, so the impact of that arriving in England, so these scientific advancements from France and from Italy that are coming into the country and shaping our language through that, and we'll just literally have new words coined for new things that didn't exist before. We've got international trade, we've got scientific developments, and we've got religious changes as well. Big battle in the 1600s between Catholics and Protestants that has brewed for quite some time, but that leads to a bit of a battle over the throne during the 1600s, where King James II, not the James of the James Bible, but King James II is essentially asked to abdicate because he's a Catholic, and by that point Catholics are seen as less less trustworthy in wider society in an increasingly Protestant country. You get in this battle between Latin and Anglo-Saxon as well. You'll get words of both, but to recognise Latin words, you're looking at they're more formal. They're usually polysyllabic, and it sounds a bit silly really, but if they feel proper, they feel high society, they feel like posh words. Often the stress is on the second syllable, which will allow you to hopefully highlight those, and often the words that we use as euphemisms are Anglo-Saxon words. So intercourse, for example, comes from Anglo-Saxon. Comes from Latin. Okay, it's a euphemism. Feces, excrement, urine. The words that we see as euphemisms often come from Latin. Okay. Examples we've got there: transmit, construct, resist, cordial, intimate, excrement, intercourse. Okay, the ex is a good sign of Latin. Okay, the prefixes and suffixes are trans or con, that they would be a marker of Latin. A word that starts with re, same thing. A word that starts with x, same thing. Okay, a word with course in there somewhere, either at the start or end of the word. Anglo-Saxon shorter, less syllables, less formal, often sort of shocking and harsh. Most of our swear words are Anglo-Saxon. Words like send, build, stop, hearty, mock, and let's keep it PG friendly, but the S word, the F word, okay, come from Anglo-Saxon. Okay, those hard consonant sounds, short syllable sounds, and short words will mark words out as Anglo-Saxon. And the key thing you could look for is, well, what words do you have of each, and how are they used and why? So, big linguistic changes we get in the 1600s. Look for these. Look for prefixation and suffixation. In other words, words or prefixes added to the start of words and words or prefixes added to the ends of counterstroke. Disabuse, disrobe. Notice the dis start. Interlink, the inter start. The non start of word, or the sub or the un start of word. They mark out words as being Latinate, but they also show the linguistic changes in the 1600s. So have a look for those. Similarly, suffixation. So considerable, the able ending, or drisling, the ing ending. Okay, et, maturity, laughable, the able ending. Okay, they are marking words out as new in the 1600s that are coming from French and Latin. Similarly, compounding, putting two words together, laughing stock, pincushion, pinecone, putting two words together. Okay, those things didn't happen so much in Anglo-Saxon, so they're new words that you could talk about lexically in the 1600s. Okay, so by and large, we've got this view that Anglo-Saxon is primarily for the peasants, Latin and French is for the worthy people. So if you're seeing a written text, chances are it wasn't written for the peasants of society, so it's going to probably include more French and Latin vocabulary as a marker of class and of the audience. Okay, so just the difference there between the Germanic and Latin words hopefully illustrates that. The fact that in Latin as well we've got all these different endings, and that's why in Latin it's so important with who versus whom, because how it functions in the sentence changes the word that you use. In English it doesn't. There's a great example actually of I think it was from the 1700s, not the 1600s, but a grammar book where it gives you a table like this Latin one with the word duck, and the word is just ducks in every case, so whether it's the subject or the object of the sentence, it's just a duck, and it's a great example of how they're trying to impose Latin rules onto English. And that only carries on as time goes on. In terms of orthography, key things you're looking for is that long S. It looks like an F, but it's what's seen as a long S. It's an archaic spelling that you will probably see in some 1600s texts. Okay. There's also massive variations in spelling. It's seen as a Wild West of spelling. Nobody can agree on anything. There's not a definite spelling for anything. Shakespeare spelt his name multiple times throughout his lifetime. Okay, spellings haven't been defined yet. Widespread dictionaries aren't kind of occurring. The language hasn't been set in stone. So Caxton uses book and axed and axe, different spellings, just interchangeably. Bullocker in 1580 starts to propose some rules, okay, and he suggests 37 letters, 26 regular letters that we have, and then extra words extra letters that we have there. We have this S that looks like the F, usually at the start or the middle of the word, whereas the normal S that we would use is at the end of a word or afterwards. So that's this rule that starts to standardise the S, and then over time that long S disappears actually altogether. Okay, notice there that's William Shakespeare's signatures. All the spellings are different, okay, because Shakespeare, like many people at the time, didn't have fixed spellings even for his own name. There's also a really good example of the long S in action. In King James, the King James Bible, we get the word succor used a lot of times, okay. So the succor, the food that you are provided, okay. There is a great clip from Vicar of Dibley where Alice gets a bit mixed up with the long S that we get at the start of the word succor and almost says a terrible thing on points of view. So it's just a nice illustration of how this long S works in these older texts. Other things you might notice a U for a V, you might notice a V for a U, you'll notice a long S. You'll notice that AE being joined, it comes from Anglo-Saxon and is still stuck around into the 1600s. So these are things you can comment on, because they're differences between the texts. The Y for I, often they were seen as interchangeable, and the final E will often be at the end of the words. In Middle English, the final E is pronounced, so if you have an E at the end, you'd say the E at the end. You don't anymore in the 1600s, but the E sticks around for a while. So they are the things you can comment on. Similarly, capitalisation. Originally every important common noun was capitalised, so in the 1600s you might notice any noun that was seen as important will have a capital letter. It's a really good thing to focus on before those standardisation rules have come in. 1600s we start to get 1600s we start to get titles included in that. We get more capitalisation in books from the continent, so that influences it. Some books capitalise every noun, partly because printers were a bit confused by it, just went to just stick a capital letter at the start of everything. So we're noticing there's a big move here of non-standardisation, which isn't really fixed until the 1700s. Okay, so in the 18th century, the 1700s, this started to die out. 1600s, you'll probably see a fair bit of variation. It's really good to comment on why it might be, what's going on. Are there some rules? Are there not? And you can try and sort of unpick what the rules might be that they're following. You also get ye used in as a pronoun. Okay. So for plural, so if you're speaking to a group of people, you'll say ye rather than you, as we'd say today. So we get the difference between singular and plural pronouns there. There was a really good example. There's a great example in King Lear where Kent says to the king, "What will thou do, old man?" And it's seen as really offensive because thou you say to your friends, but you wouldn't say to a king. And that again is a remnant of French. In France, you have tu and vous, and one is formal and one is informal. They both mean you, but you use them in different situations. English took that rule on. We had you for formal and thou for informal. Over time, that's died out, and we just use you all of the time now. But again, text from the 1600s, you might see that, and you might notice the shift in whether it's formal or informal. It's great to talk about. Okay, you get relative pronouns used differently. That, which, who are just used in a different way to what we'd use today. So, shall I of surety bear a child, which I am old? We'd probably say when nowadays. Verbs, you often get the est ending. So, thou mayest, thou beest. Okay, so you get that est ending, which is an archaism. You might look out for the th, the third person singular ending, although it starts to fall out of usage. So he doth bestride rather than he does. And you will often get comparatives and superlatives doubled up. So, for example, this is the most unkindest, or more better. Nowadays, we'd see those as incorrect because you're doubling up. It's like a double negative. But there we see it as just adding to the emphasis. Similarly, actually, double negatives are the same. Shakespeare often uses double negatives to add emphasis. Nowadays, we see that as incorrect. In the 1600s, that just adds to how strongly you feel. You start to get adverbs, the ly ending coming in as well. Okay, syntax generally actually is the same. The word order by and large is the same as we'd use today. Occasionally, you get verb and subject. Swapped round. Okay, so you get the verb first and then the subject. Okay, so swim I all day. Yeah, so we're getting the other way around. And hereof cometh the destruction of the reprobate. So rather than the destruction of the reprobate is coming, where we foreground the subject, the destruction, the thing's on its way. Here it comes. It's the destruction. Okay, so we get that swapping round, and again, anything that you notice that's different for syntax, for orthography or lexis, other things to comment on. Okay, double negatives are okay. I will not meddle with no duplicity, so it just adds to the emphasis there. Okay, in terms of lexis, we get more specialised terms from the Renaissance, of scientific terms for musical instruments, terms for diseases. They'll start to be coming into text if it's the appropriate genre. So you could look out for those things. Okay, and look out for the subordinate conjunctions as well. Okay, look out for quantities, look out for measurement, look out for numbers. It's that move towards a more scientific language that we get in the 1600s. Okay. So look at the number of clauses, phrases in a single sentence, discuss the length, discuss the complexity, look out for multiple subordinate clauses, and then start to look at how they're put together. What are the words that are bringing those clauses in? Are there unnecessary words? Are there unnecessary phrases? And what is that adding to the language? Okay, what's the impact of that? What I'll do in the next video is look at an extract from The Rover, which is a real text. It's fiction, so that they wouldn't tend to give you fiction. It's normally non-fiction, but it's a fiction text. It's written by a woman, which is quite rare in the 1600s, but it's a really good example to unpick what's going on with orthography, with lexis, and with grammar. And this is exactly the sort of thing that you would need to do when you start to unpick a text. So in the next video, I'll zoom into a text and actually look at, well, what might we say about the rover.